Доброе утро, глубоко уважаемые дамы и господа. Дорогие друзья, коллеги, разрешите прежде всего представиться. Меня зовут Соколова Наталья Леонидовна. Я являюсь директором Института иностранных языков Российского университета дружбы народов. Я с большим удовольствием приветствую всех присутствующих на нашем замечательном форуме, на конференции, которая носит название «Функциональные аспекты межкультурной коммуникации и проблемы перевода». Наша конференция является международной, научной, междисциплинарной. Она проходит уже 7-й год подряд. И все 7 лет на мою долю выпадает высокая честь приветствовать вас на нашей замечательной встрече. Прежде всего, я хочу выразить глубочайшую благодарность всем тем, кто поддержал наш институт, наш университет и принял участие в этой конференции. Наших друзей из разных стран мира, разных континентов. Спасибо вам большое, дорогие. Мы живем в очень непростое время. И 2020 год останется в нашей памяти, в наших сердцах, как год величайшей трагедии. Трагедии, поразившей весь мир. Трагедии, унесшей тысячи и тысячи жизней. И прежде чем приступить к основной части своего приветствия и перейти к нашей конференции, я хочу сейчас вместе с вами почтить память тех, кто безвозвратно покинул нас из-за пандемии. Я хочу вместе с вами почтить минутой молчания память навсегда унесенных ветром COVID-19. Благодарю вас, мои дорогие. Участниками и докладчиками нашей конференции сегодня стали 198 человек из 20 зарубежных стран. Это такие страны, как Беларусь, Бельгия, Великобритания, Германия, Грузия, Дания, Иран, Испания, Казахстан, Китай, Соединенные Штаты Америки, Таджикистан, Тунис, Узбекистан, Украина, Швеция и не только. И в нашей конференции принимают участие 12 регионов России. У нас сегодня есть представители Архангельска, Барнаула, Иркутска, Калининграда, Москвы, Нижнего Новгорода, Орла, Ростова-на-Дону, Самары, Санкт-Петербурга, Томска, Тюмени. Дорогие друзья, я всех вас еще раз приветствую и сердечно благодарю за внимание и поддержку. Соучредителями нашей конференции являются такие именитые факультеты и вузы, как филологический факультет Московского государственного университета имени Ломоносова, факультет письменного и устного перевода Университета Гранады, научно-исследовательский центр «Русский мир» Университета Гранады, Высший институт языков Туниса Университета Карфагена, Университет Юнинорте Парагвая, Московский государственный лингвистический университет, Институт образования университета Рейдинга. Фамилии ученых, которые принимают участие в нашей конференции, вы услышите по ходу конференции. Я хочу сказать, что несмотря на все те трудности, которые мы сегодня претерпеваем, несмотря на карантинные меры и удаленку, мы не разъединены, а мы объединены еще больше. Мы одна большая, сплоченная семья людей, занимающихся гуманитарным образованием, гуманитарными науками, людей, которые постоянно совершенствуются, которые постоянно в движении вперед и вверх. Проблемы, которыми мы занимаемся, связаны с коммуникацией в целом и межкультурной коммуникацией, с проблемами перевода, то есть языкового посредничества. И покуда будут живы люди, наше с вами великое дело, наша с вами великая наука будет жива. Благодаря современным технологиям, благодаря цифровизации мы имеем возможность встречаться на таких замечательных платформах, как Microsoft Teams, Zoom. Мы имеем возможность коммуникировать практически круглые сутки. А вы сами прекрасно знаете, что в связи с пандемией мы уже работаем не по 6, не по 8 часов, и даже, наверное, не по 24. Мы всегда в движении, мы всегда вместе. У нас единая международная семья. Сегодня работа нашей конференции будет проходить в рамках пленарного заседания, круглого стола «Тематические тренды научных публикаций и этической политики журналов», 9 секций и 2 воркшопов. Секции и воркшопы начнут работу параллельно на 4 треках на платформах Zoom и Microsoft Teams. Нас с вами ждет событие, которое произойдет постфактум. Это сборник материалов конференции, который будет индексирован в РИНЦ и отправлен на индексацию в штаб-квартиру Scopus. Дорогие мои, еще раз от всей души сердечно приветствую вас, участников 7-й международной научной междисциплинарной конференции «Функциональные аспекты межкультурной коммуникации и проблемы перевода». Наша конференция приурочена к 60-летнему юбилею Российского университета дружбы народов. Спасибо вам еще раз от лица Института иностранных языков РУДН и всего Российского университета дружбы народов в целом. И мы переходим к нашим основным докладам в рамках пленарного заседания. Я с большим удовольствием предоставляю слово профессору, доктору Харальду Байену, профессору квантитативной лингвистики Тюбингенского университета Эберхарда и Карла, Германия. Тема его доклада «Взвешенный взгляд на изучение нового языка». Харальд Байен, Германия, профессор, доктор наук, Тюбингенский университет Эберхарда и Карла. Harold, we are ready to listen to your report.
Okay, thank you. I cannot yet share my screen. So could you please give me permission to start sharing my screen? Then I can bring up my slides.
No problem, take your time, please.
Yeah, but at the moment, I cannot share my screen because somebody else has the control over the screen sharing. So in Zoom, you have to give me permission to start screen sharing.
Okay, I'll just contact my colleagues and will help you.
Yeah.
Леонид Николаевич Чефилев, для того, чтобы Харальд мог присоединиться к нам, мы должны дать ему разрешение на то, чтобы он вывел презентацию на экран. Леонид Николаевич, слышите меня?
Да, Наталья, сейчас все сделаем.
Спасибо. Harold, we are working already.
Sure. There's somewhere in Zoom, there is some control that you have as host, and then you have to basically grant me permission to share the screen.
I got it. Thank you. Probably it will take just a minute.
Yeah, no problem.
Леночка, получится? Something is already happening.
Yeah. Yes, I can now share.
Good, wonderful. Thank you very much. I can see you perfectly well. Very good. And I see your presentation. Good.
Good.
Wonderful.
Then I can get started.
Do
Excellent.
please. You're mostly welcome.
So what I will do this morning is present to you some work that I've been doing in collaboration with one of my postdocs, Chung Yuying and Melanie Bell from Cambridge. And before I proceed, I would like to thank you for your invitation to present at this conference. The starting point for the research program that this research is part of is that what we find when we look at human cognition is that there is an enormous flexibility in learning. As an interesting experiment from Brad Marsalek, where he presented people with two pictures. First, you had to look at the first picture, then at the second picture, and then say the name of the second picture. And in one condition of the experiment, you first saw a big grand piano, then a table. In the second condition, you would see something like a football, and then the table. And the question is, in which condition are you faster to say table? Well, it turns out to be the first condition. When you see a big grand piano that has a flat surface and legs, it looks a bit like a table. And what apparently happens is that as you are realizing that you're looking at a grand piano, the features of a grand piano are strengthened to grand piano and weakened to table. And then if you have to say table subsequently, you are slightly less good at recognizing the table. This kind of finding can be explained with a very simple learning rule formulated by Rescorla Wagner in the 70s. Here you see two examples from language. Suppose that you see the word cat and you think of a cat and cat is correct in context. Then what you do is you strengthen the connections to cat, but there is another word that has a K like key, you weaken the connections to key. But if you get you read key, then you can strengthen the connections to key and weaken them to cat. And this is a very important aspect of learning, of error-driven learning, that you are constantly recalibrating the weights in these kinds of networks. Now, the Squella-Wagner rule itself goes back to an earlier rule set up by Widrow and Hoff in 1960. And it turns out that these simple learning rules turn out to implement what we can call incremental linear regression. Now, there's an interesting evolutionary take on these rules. These rules learn rapidly. There are learning rules that can do better. However, for a short-lived organism, a quick and dirty learning in a short life is actually an evolutionary advantage. Now, what we are trying to do in our research program is to keep the mathematics as simple and transparent as possible. And that gives us what I would like to call interpretable machine learning. We also try to develop models that should work already with limited training data, compatible with the limits on human experience. In natural language processing, there are lots of algorithms that are trained on the whole of Wikipedia and more. But for me, I look up things in Wikipedia. There's most of what is in Wikipedia is stuff that I don't know. So what I will do today is focus on the relation between meaning and form, mostly in words. And what we hope is that we can capture this kind of human trial-to-trial learning. The core ideas of our approach are that we start with very high dimensional representations of form and meaning. And then we have two kinds of algorithms for moving between form and meaning. We have the incremental step-by-step learning algorithms of Widrow, Hoff, and Rescorla-Wagner. And we have a kind of end state of learning algorithm. And then we use the linear algebra of multivariate multiple regression. Let me give you a bit of an idea of how we proceed. So if we think about words in the translation, we'll come to the translation of words in a bit. What we have to do is we have to represent words' forms as numeric vectors, and we have to represent words' meanings as numeric vectors. And then we want to be able to move between form and meaning, either looking at the end state of learning or using incremental step-by-step learning. Here is the basic idea. We have here some form vectors in blue. On the right, we have meaning vectors in red. Here we have the vector A, which has coordinates 1 and 2. Here we have the vector 2 minus 4. This mapping F takes the form vector and puts it in a semantic space. And we have a mapping G that takes this vector A and moves it back to its original position. In other words, if we can represent words' forms numerically and words' meanings numerically, then we can model comprehension by going from form to meaning, and we can model production by going from meaning back to form. So how then might we specify words' forms? We do that. This is one of the most simple ways. When we do this with real audio, it is much more complex. But here we have three words: cat, dog, and cut. You see here letter pairs or phone pairs. And for the word cat, we put a 1 whenever a phone pair is present. The hash here means silence. So this is word beginning K. This is word ending T. And cat has k, cat, and t in it. And for dog, we have other features active. And for cut, we have the features over here. And then for each word, we also set up some kind of numeric vector in some high dimensional semantic space. What we then get are very simple networks. Here we have a network that goes from the phone pairs to some semantic set of units. And we can also go from the semantics back to the forms when we're looking at production. Okay, so we have very, very simple networks. Actually, I don't think that the networks could be any simpler. But if we want to model what's going on in the mental lexicon, we need multiple networks. And this is the kind of general model with which we are working. So we are working on auditory comprehension from speech. Then there is information, sound waves that reach the cochlea in the ear, and those are mapped onto particular auditory vectors that are then mapped onto the semantic vectors. And if we want to speak, we start with some semantic vector representing what we want to say, and then we get some representation that can drive the articulators. If we want to evaluate how well the model understands something, then we say, okay, the model produces this blue vector when listening to cat. It should have produced the red vector. That's the vector that really represents cat. But if this blue vector is close enough to the red vector, then we will be happy. More specifically, if there are no other vectors that are produced by the model that are closer to the red cat vector, then we will be deciding that the model got it correct. When we think about speech production, the semantic vectors produce a pattern of activation over the form vectors. We then take a form vector. We only consider those phone pairs or phone triplets that have some minimal support from the semantics. And then we select for production that sequence of diphones or triphones that best matches the meaning that the speaker wants to express. And this is what we call synthesis by analysis. So in this model, production depends on the comprehension system. Understanding precedes speaking. And there's also in the neurocognition literature some evidence that there is crosstalk between production and comprehension during speech production. Now, we have been applying this very simple approach to various kinds of data. For instance, with these models, if you do step-by-step learning, then we can model what goes on in the course of an experiment. And as we let the model learn while the subject goes through the experiment, and then we get better predictions for things like reaction times. But there are also other findings. For instance, people have been working on the duration of the word final S in English, which realizes lots of different functions from the verb, third person singular, and noun plurals, possessives, various clitic functions. And it appears that there are some systematic differences in the durations of these different S's. And we can model that very well with this very simple modeling setup. Now on to multilingual lexical processing. So now we have to start thinking about how to define meaning vectors for a bilingual or a trilingual speaker. There is literature out there on bilingual word embeddings. So numeric vectors that are built from word co-occurrences in parallel corpora. And it's amazing what they can do. But from a cognitive perspective, I have the feeling that we don't really learn from parallel corpora when we learn another language. What we have been doing is working with WordNet or BabelNet, which is a nice resource that tries to construct a kind of ontology with sets of synonyms that are then ordered in relations of hyponymy and hyperonymy. This, of course, also has its disadvantages because if you construct a word net for English, then it will have an English bias. That's something that we're not particularly happy about. But for now, for the research that I'm reporting on today, this is what we will work with. So what we do is we construct semantic vectors from words hypernym chains. So here you have an example of English palm, which can have the sense of a hand inside of your hand, or it can be a kind of tree. And if we look at the synsets in WordNet, the synset hierarchy, you start with palm as hand, area, region, body part, part, thing, physical entity, and you end up with the most general one, entity. If we do this for tree, we start with palm is palm tree, tree, a woody plant, a vascular plant, plant, organism, living thing, whole unit, object, physical entity, and entity. So when we put these things together into semantic vectors, then we can have here in the first line palm as hand, the second palm as tree, and then we have Handfläche in German for the equivalent of the hand palm, and Palme for the tree in German. And you will see that the synsets in which are specified for these words will be the same for hand in English and Handfläche, but we also have here something that distinguishes between English and German. The vectors for the forms of these words are, in this case, triplets of phones. So again, if we're looking at English palm, then you have here p and palm as relevant triphones. If you look at Palme in German, then you need another vowel. And here, for instance, you have the triphone pal, and there is a 1 here because this particular triphone is present in the German pronunciation. Here you can then see for this toy example what the network looks like. We have triphones and we have semantic units, and we have actually 2 networks, one that goes from the form to the meanings and one from the meanings to the forms. Learning in this setup, step by step, shows you a bit, we can inspect that, and then you can see how the learning takes place. So here we are looking at the situation in which you want to express tree in German. And we are looking at the connection strength from tree to German, the German triphone pal. The red dots represent this learning, and as the network is going through more and more examples, you can see that the association strength increases. The blue dots are the cases where the model has to produce the English word palm rather than the German word palme. In this case, the connection strength to pal is unlearned. So whenever you have a blue dot, the curve goes down. When the semantics is for not for tree, but for hand palm, and then we get the gray dots, and then no learning takes place. Now, in the materials, we work with some 400 different words of English, German, Mandarin, and Dutch. And it so happened that in English and German, there were many homophones. In Mandarin and Dutch, we had far fewer homophones. That is, to some extent, just a, a somewhat arbitrary property of the data set. But it told us something. Here you see monolingual learning. So we have here the three languages, English, German, Dutch, and Mandarin is lagging behind a bit. This is comprehension, and what you see on the horizontal axis is time. On the vertical axis, you see the proportion of the vocabulary that the model correctly recognizes. And then here on, you see the production, and now you see that suddenly Mandarin and Dutch are learned better, and that German and English suffer more. It turns out that this is due to the presence of lots of homophones in the English and German data sets. The problem for the model is when it gets a homophone and you have to learn what it means, half of the time it means one thing and half of the time it means something else. So that means that in the learning setup, half of the time, let's say that cat is a homophone and that it means cat or key, then half of the time you get cat meaning the animal, and then you have to downgrade the weights to key. But then the other half of the time you get to upgrade these weights and downgrade these weights. So this homophones make life sorry, difficult for the model. Now, if we look at simultaneous bilingual learning with this model, comprehension works fairly fine. You see here with these dots at the right-hand side, that's the end state of learning. So comprehension very quickly asymptotes to what it should be. But now if we look at production, then production suffers, and you see here language intrusion. So words from the other language are used. So English words instead of the German words, or German words instead of the English words. And it turns out that if we do not include any homophones in our data set, then you have some intrusions early on in learning, but they fade away and production ultimately will be very precise, although it lags behind comprehension. Now, of course, languages do have homophones, and it turns out that if we add a tiny bit of noise to the semantic vectors, then the problem with the language intrusions almost disappears. We can, in the model, model various kinds of bilingual learning. We can have non-balanced bilinguals. So here you start learning English and then later German comes in. We can move the moment that you start to learn German up front. We can change the amount of experience you have with a language. So most of the time you speak English, but sometimes German. And you see on the left the comprehension profiles. That's always worked quite nicely. And here, when homophones are present and we don't add noise, you can see that there is considerable problems with language intrusions. This is another example of where we work with trilinguals. So now we have an English speaker, a German speaker, and then later you also start learning. So you learn English first, then you start learning German, and then finally you add Mandarin. And the patterns look very similar. So where does this approach take us? Well, we see in the simulations that onset of acquisition and amount of exposure matter exactly as one would like. We see also that production lags behind comprehension. Comprehension quickly approaches the asymptote of learning, whereas production may never get there. The within language homophones introduce frailty. You still recognize the word correctly, but the precision with which you recognize the words goes down. And that turns out to make especially the production system quite vulnerable. And we can remove that frailty or decrease it substantially by making the words semantic vectors a little bit more idiosyncratic. And that is actually something that makes a lot of sense, because words between languages and within languages, they simply have their own idiosyncrasies of use. So this kind of modeling approach, and this is the first study that we've ever worked on in the domain of bilingualism and multilingualism, it generates straightforward predictions that help us move a little bit forward from traditional concepts such as frequency or entrenchment that are often called upon in studies of bilingualism. The learning approach that I have laid out here differs fundamentally from the traditional dictionary metaphor that is used in lexical learning. So often people assume that there are forms that have been stored and you have to look up a form and then you can find its meaning. But in this model, there are no stored representations. The memory is the network. There are not even hidden layers in the network. Meanings are generated on the fly from the form input. And if you have a concept you want to express, then it generates the form on the fly. We are currently working on extending this approach to morphologically complex words and to simple utterances. And what we hope is that the model will prove to be a useful tool for linguistic research. Some final thoughts on translating and culture. When you do modeling, you necessarily are simplifying. When you start modeling, as we did, very naively looking at bilingual learning, then the complexity of cross-language semantics immediately becomes apparent. We had to add noise to our nice and clean semantic vectors from WordNet. Now, I don't think that we actually have semantic representations that are identical across languages. And even within languages, people's own experiences can vary so much that communication can be far from trivial. So what I see as one of the challenges for us is when we model bilingual learning is to do justice to the cultural differences that exist, and perhaps to be satisfied with communication that is good enough for the purposes of the pertinent social interactions. What a word means in one speaker community and the other, there will be some overlaps, and maybe some of the overlaps are captured roughly by something like a WordNet ontology, but then there are all kinds of subtle nuances that the speaker in another language will simply not get from just a translation. And that means that in cross-cultural communication, speakers will have to negotiate the cultural differences between concepts that in translation at first sight might seem the same, but are not. And I'm sure that what I'm saying here is something that you all are very much familiar with if I look at the various topics that will be discussed later in this at this conference. That brings me to the end of my presentation. Thank you for your attention.
Harold, thank you very much for your vivid presentation. It was a pleasure listening to you, and thank you for your participation in our conference. Hope we'll be friends forever. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Дорогие друзья, а я передаю слово второму ключевому выступающему на нашем пленарном заседании, профессору, доктору Волтеру Дайлимансу, профессору компьютерной лингвистики Антверпенского университета, Бельгия, и тема его доклада «Вычислительная стилометрия. Профилирование авторов текста в социальных сетях методами машинного обучения». Walter, welcome.
Thank you. Can I share the screen, or will you do that?
We already see you. I think that you're already on the screen, so we can see you.
But I don't see my desktop. If I want to share the screen, I can share the screen, but I can't share a presentation. So at first sight.
You can't share the presentation. Okay, I'll find out. Леонид Николаевич, Волтер говорит, что он не может поделиться презентацией.
You have to basically give the presentation authority from me to Walter.
Oh, thank you very much. You're very helpful. Thanks a lot. Леонид Николаевич, вот Харалд говорит, что мы должны передать права презентации от Харалда к Волтеру. Леонид Николаевич, слышите меня? I'm absolutely sure they are working at it.
Okay.
Dear Walter, it's me, Natalia. You now, when Harold has stopped his presentation, now you could show your presentation too. Could you do this?
Yeah, so I try to share a screen, but I'm not seeing anything then. So there's one button, share screen. But it gives me a whiteboard and an iPhone, etc., but not my presentations. I don't see my desktop then, which I should see.
Леонид Николаевич, я вас не слышу. Если можно, скажите, чем нам можно помочь? Волтер не может поделиться, то есть мы его видим, но он не может поделиться экраном.
So if I do share screen, I still see that I have the authority for sharing screen.
Значит, вот
I shouldn't have that.
Значит, ситуация такая. Все права на то, чтобы поделиться экраном, сейчас находятся у Харалда. Эти права нужно у Харалда забрать и передать Волтеру.
All right, it's changing now. Let's have a look.
It's okay?
At least something is happening.
Probably we'll have to wait. Oh, good. Now it's...
Yeah, do you see my presentation now?
Yeah, I do.
Okay, fantastic. All right, so...
Harold, thank you very much for help. Walter, thank you very much for waiting. Thanks a lot.
Well, thanks for the invitation. So I'm actually speaking from Antwerp, which is a very nice city in Belgium. So I would have loved to be in Moscow today, but unfortunately that's not possible, of course. So you will have to do with a remote presentation.
Walter, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I'm absolutely sure that the happy day will come, and we'll see you in Moscow. You're mostly welcome. Just we'll keep in touch. I'm absolutely sure we'll be together forever, and you're mostly welcome in Moscow.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm looking forward to that. So my research group is mainly about computational linguistics, but we also do research in psycholinguistics and social linguistics. But I will focus today on new developments in artificial intelligence and computational linguistics mainly. And of course, you will have heard about the so-called revolution of deep learning methods in the last decade or so, which is actually more about representation learning than about really solving problems, I think. So that's where the interest is. There is some superficial connection also with how the brain works, but nobody really believes that deep learning methods and the algorithms that are being used there have any real connection with how it works in the brain. But they have very interesting mathematical properties. And Harold already mentioned a few of them. So regarding incremental learning and regarding the learning of representations. So the example that mostly is given is about image processing. So on top here, you see a deep neural network with different internal hidden layers that learns how to recognize faces. And the interesting part from a scientific point of view is that the network in an unsupervised way learns representations that are relevant in solving the task. For example, in this case, it learns about the edges in figures. It learns about parts of faces like noses and mouths. And it also, in the end, learns about, let's say, how to combine these patterns into individual faces that can then be recognized. So the question is, of course, does this also work for language? Can we find hidden layers that represent morphology or syntax or some other type of linguistic knowledge? So because of the topic of the conference, I will focus mainly on machine translation. But this works also for a large number of other applications like automatic summarization or a simplification of text or the extraction of concepts and relations from text. So the same architecture, which is this deep learning neural network architecture, has been applied to very many different natural language processing tasks. In a short presentation of 20 minutes, there's of course no time to go into the details of architectures. So this is actually the previous architecture that Google uses for machine translation, which is based still on recurrent neural networks. So the hype of the day is transformer networks that have a number of interesting additional properties. But the interesting part here to know is that now these systems have developed to the level that they can actually translate complete sentences rather than that they need to split up a sentence into the word level and then look at the local context. So these networks can now learn complete sentences. And what's also interesting from a linguistic point of view is that they develop their own morphology. So they are character-based, which means that they don't have any assumptions about what the words in a language are. And they try to find out with byte pair encoding, which is a fairly simple method, statistical unsupervised learning method. They try to find out for a particular language processing task, which segments in these strings of characters are actually the words that should be recognized in the system. And so, of course, this is the engineering perspective. So what they claim, and this has been corroborated in a number of say longitudinal studies of the accuracy of machine translation systems, that the newest architectures, like these neural machine translation systems, are getting near to human level performance for some language pairs, but not for all of them and not in all directions. And then I don't know if you noticed that, but in April, I think, or in April, May of this year, there was a kind of a bombshell in artificial intelligence with the publication by OpenAI, which is an artificial intelligence company in US, of GPT-3, which is, well, GPT stands for Generative Pre-trained Transformer. So it's actually just a language model, which is perhaps not even simpler than the model we saw in the lecture before, because all it does is to predict the next word given, let's say, a string of previous words, which can be a very long string. And by doing that on a gigantic corpus, this system was developed, GPT-3, to which all kinds of interesting behaviors have been ascribed. So again, there's no time to go really into the details, but I will give you a flavor of the scale of the thing. You could really call it a monster. It has 175 billion parameters. So every weight in a neural network is a parameter. So in this case, I would expect, for example, Harold's network to have a few tens of thousands of parameters. Here we are talking about 170 billion parameters. And an exponential growth compared to the previous model. And also, if you look at on which data this system was trained, it's trained on 500 billion words, which were scraped from or crawled from the internet. So you could say that a large part of the internet is just in that model. And everything it does to train itself is to predict the next word, which is called an autoregressive approach to training neural networks. So why did this create such a shockwave in artificial intelligence? Well, it was sort of comparable with AI winning in chess from Kasparov, or AI winning from the Go world champion a few years ago, because for the first time, this is a completely unsupervised model. So it's not really like in Google Translate that you presented a parallel corpus with one language as input and the other language as output, and then you have to align the different sentences in both languages at the translation level, perhaps even at the word level, and then you learn a model. No, this one has really learned just by predicting the next word on the internet, given everything that comes before, or a large part of what came before. And what has been shown meanwhile, so it's in the previous few months, is that this model is actually pretty good at a number of different tasks, like text generation, question answering, even arithmetic. So solving sums and divisions and multiplications, even doing programming. So you could describe in natural language what you want your code to do, your program to do, and then it would generate a program in C or in R or in Python that would actually do it, and even in machine translation. So what you see now in the field of artificial intelligence is that there are two polarized opinions. It's pretty bad, but polarization is almost as bad as the polarization you see in a number of other topics. There are really firm believers now that think this is an important step towards artificial general intelligence. So it's solving the problem that up to now artificial intelligence systems were one-trick ponies. They were pretty good at solving one problem, but not in solving the complete set of problems that a general intelligence would have to solve. And then there's people who are, and I would count myself to that part of the research community, that think that it's really just but a bigger trick than the kind of tricks that we have seen before. So if you look at the size of the model, you see that there's only a factor of almost 3 of compression of this gigantic input data set. So actually what could be happening here is that it's retrieval rather than generalization what is happening here. But then there is some motivation that you could say that, well, perhaps that's how cognition works. That's how our brain works as well. We just generalize a little bit. So we interpolate a little bit from stored information that we have gathered during our lifetimes. And there's also a problem with model bias, but I will get to that in a second. So what you will probably be mostly interested in is if this model also works for translation. And then you see that indeed, even with only 8% of the data being non-English data, and the model being completely unsupervised. So nobody said to the model, okay, here's an input and here's an output translation in the English-French pair, for example. So that it was not really trained in an unsupervised way, that nevertheless it gets state-of-the-art performance in the engineering approach of machine translation, which is really impressive. Right, you see the supervised state-of-the-art is still better, but remember that this model, in some cases, but remember that this model was not trained to do machine translation. It was trained to do next word generation. And you actually see that for English, it's beating the state-of-the-art for the translating into English, but not yet from English. But that's just a matter of time to add other languages to the data set to be able to also do that better. And so here is how GPT-3 works. So you give your task in plain English, like translate English to French. You give a few examples, or only one example, or even no examples. And then you give the prompt, and the GPT-3 will generate an output, which often will be very sensible and interesting. So of course, the task description is important. Nobody really understands what's happening here because this is just a model that takes text and tries to predict something from that. What happens here probably is that this acts as a kind of a filter on the parameters of the network to switch out some of the say parts of the network and switch on other parts to solve this particular task. So what I would like to, so I already said I'm at the part of the non-believers that this is really, let's say, a real general intelligence. Because if we look at language understanding, rather than just translating patterns, which is what neural networks do, we see there's still a lot of problems with, for example, domain adaptation, figurative language use. There's no solution yet for problems like irony detection, humor detection, metaphor detection. There's a little bit of work, but not really very convincing. And certainly not in the generation of creative language. So that's still an issue. But actually nobody has investigated that yet for the problem with the GPT-3 model. So this work is ongoing. So there are very, very good examples that you can always use and that I always use to say, okay, show me that your model solves this type of problem, which are very easy for human translators to do, for example, or for human interpreters, because they have to do with background knowledge and with common sense reasoning. So this actually goes back to work by Winograd in the 70s, 1970s. Terry Winograd was a really big figure in artificial intelligence then, but he stopped working in the area because he thought that computers would never be able to solve this type of problem. And so one of the examples is, for example, the city councilman refused to demonstrate as a permit because and then you have either feared violence or advocated violence. And somehow, even when perhaps this is not the case anymore, we know by the cultural background, we know how to interpret the day. We can interpret it as councilmen in the case of feared violence, and we can interpret it as demonstrators in the case of advocated violence. It's really very hard to get that type of common sense and background knowledge into computer systems, into computer models. It was difficult in the 70s and 80s. It still is difficult right now. There has been not a lot of progress in that area. Although you could say that somehow in these weights of GPT-3, there might be a lot of common sense knowledge also available. It's just not really clear how to get that out of the system. So, and then there's other problems. Okay, we are working on well, not me, but a lot of people are working on self-driving cars. Would you buy a self-driving car that is 99.99% correct, but then at some point might drive off a cliff without any real explanation why it does that? You would not accept that because you want to understand errors systems make. And so that's completely not the case in these deep learning systems. They produce errors which are weird and unexpected, and sometimes very simple cases get confused, whereas very complex cases are handled perfectly well. And then there's of course also the problem of bias. So these networks like GPT-3, they are based on the complete internet, but there's a lot of, yeah, I wouldn't call it noise. I'm thinking of a nice word to use. There's a lot of, let's say, not really very interesting information on the internet as well. And all that is taken up by the model as well. And you can actually show that by letting the networks do analogies. This is actually for a more simple network. You can, for example, solve the analogy man is to king as woman is to queen. So nobody put that in the network, but it comes out by itself. Or Paris is to France as Tokyo is to, and then the network will predict Japan. But it will also have a lot of, for example, sexist and racist information in the network that it will happily use when you're trying to make it do analogies. Like father is to doctor, like mother is to, and then we will get nurse. Okay, that's perhaps not really what we want the network to believe, right? That there's a difference there. Or man is to computer programmer, like woman is to homemaker. If you look in different dimensions of this semantic space, you can see that she is associated with midwife and sewing, where he is associated with doctor and carpentry, physician, and so on. So it's really, there's a lot of information there, which is societally, say, present in the internet or in any corpus or data set that you use, but that we don't want our networks to pick up from the data. So just in summary then for my introduction to deep learning, there's a very interesting book by Daniel Kahneman, which you perhaps know, or I think many of you will know, Thinking Fast and Slow. It's a kind of a popularization of the research literature about this that he did with colleagues. It is a very good summary, and so he makes a very convincing point that cognition, that the mind is actually consisting of two subsystems. There's system one, which is automatic, intuitive, unconscious, and based on learning from experience. And then we have system two. Whenever you solve a task with your system two brain or mind, although there's of course not places in the brain that separate these two, But if you're solving a hard problem, your pupils widen, for example, so it's even, you can even biologically measure whether you're doing an automatic compiled problem like System 1, or if when you're doing a hard problem that involves knowledge and reasoning and consciousness. And I would say that these deep learning methods are excellent System 1 approximations, because they do learn from experience, they do have a lot of capacities, they work completely automatic, but there's no intelligence inside, right? So there's not really any understanding, any real understanding. It just picks up the bias. It doesn't, there's no level of reflection. There's no level of actually composing an idea and trying to formulate that. It's just advanced pattern matching, and it does that in a very, very nice way. So neural language models, I would say, can say a lot. So they can generate a lot of language, and the language looks pretty convincing, but they don't have anything to tell, which is really what I think should be the case if you want to have a real translation, for example. Okay, so that brings me to the stylometry part that I would like to talk just 5 minutes about, which is actually the question. Okay, so if we don't believe that neural networks are a good model of how human intelligence works, and certainly not for translation, because they parrot data rather than that they generate it from understanding it. Are there any problems that they could be useful for? And actually, I think an under-researched aspect of these deep learning methods is for some tasks in stylometry that people are very bad at, like detecting that a text is a lie, that a review was not really written by someone who actually has seen the movie or has been to a hotel, but is simply generated as a lie, or personality detection. So there are machine learning systems that up to a point can get from the text that you write, whether you're an introvert or an extrovert. And the specific task I would like to talk a little bit about is native language identification, for which people are actually very bad. So this is people who write in English, for example, or in Russian, but their native language is another language. For example, my native language is Dutch, a variant of Dutch spoken in the South. So can you recognize, if I write a Russian text, I wouldn't be able to do that. So if I write an English text, can you actually see that I'm Flemish, that I'm Dutch speaking and not French speaking or German speaking? Now, people with a lot of experience in teaching language, they are become pretty good at it, but only at a level of like say 40%. If you have 5 or 6 languages, they perform better than chance, but not really a lot higher than chance. Whereas machine learning algorithms for this task are high up in the 80–90% region. So this computational stylometry problem as machine learning, you might be familiar with. There's a lot of social linguistic research on how individual variation is matched with language variation. So that's research from social linguistics and language psychology. For example, young people write different from old people, men write different from women, and you can study that, but you can also make machine learning models that actually take as input the language variation and predict the let's say, the demographic information, or for example, the natural language, the native language, or the education level, or whatever you want to predict from on the basis of text about, say, the demographic or psychological variation in people. So this is work that I did with Ilya Markov and Ehsan Lotfi, who are respectively a postdoc and a PhD in my lab. And so what we took is so this English as a foreign language data set, where people from 11 different native languages have written English essays. And so the question is, can we develop a model like these advanced deep learning models? Can we use them to better predict what the native language is of these people? People are not so very good at that point. So we started with a predecessor of GPT-3, GPT-2, which is publicly available, and it's also, let's say, it fits the computer infrastructure that we have. And what we try to do is to fine-tune for every native language. We fine-tuned the general GPT-2 model into a model of, let's say, the foreign language, the foreign native language in question. So we had one model for Arabic, one model for Chinese, one model for Turkish, and so on. And now a new unseen text is run through these different models, and you just look at the loss, which is a machine learning term indicating how far removed a particular input text is from that model. So how unexpected or how wrongly that text is classified or handled or processed by these different language-specific models. And we just choose the L1 model with the smallest loss. This is actually the most simple architecture that you could do for this problem. Because if you look at, let's say, the active research literature, people are using hundreds of different features extracted from the text, linguistic features going from morphology to distributions of errors, punctuation, etc. So there's a lot of linguistic pre-processing in these models. Here you simply fine-tune a model with this general English model, and then you see which model fits your input text best. And then what you see in the results is that we really get the best results until now that have been published with this simple model, doing better than neural networks used in a classification-based way, like supervised learning way, better than the best classical machine learning methods. And you can actually, this is why I think this also for this conference, it's a useful approach. But for people working on real translation and working on foreign language learning, that you can actually see a lot about similarities and differences. And so those aspects where the model has problems with are probably also the aspects that students will have problems with. For example, Hindi and Telugu, which are two Indian languages, are confused a lot. Same for Japanese and Korean. Oops, sorry. And if you then look at how a text is being processed by the network, then you can actually see that the blue line is Turkish. You can actually see at which point the model decides, okay, this is probably Turkish or this is probably Korean. And then you can map that very nicely to for example, for the Turkish case, with the preposition errors, which are actually a problem for Turkish native speakers learning English. Or you can map that with determiner errors, which are for Asian languages, a problem for English, like the use of determiners in noun phrases. So there's a very nice way to map that information into, let's say, insights or advice into how different native speakers groups are learning English in this case. Okay, so I would like to keep a little bit of time for possible questions. So I think my conclusion today would be that there's been a tremendous progress the last 5 years in natural language processing of the first type, Kahneman type. I'd say the pattern matching type, and you can get very far with even translation doing the pattern matching, but it's not really understanding. It's not natural language understanding. It's engineering. So what I would say is that don't throw out these deep learning, don't believe in the hype, but also don't throw them out. because these methods are really very good at finding patterns where people are not good at finding patterns in data. So that's probably where we should be using them. Okay, so I think I'll stop here. I think this is the last slide also. Yeah. So thank you for your kind attention.
Walter, thank you very much. It was very informative. Dear colleagues, if you have any questions to Harold or Walter, you're mostly welcome to ask them now. Any questions? Okay, if there are no questions now, but probably you'll think of a question or two later. You can send your questions to us, and we'll just pass your questions to Harold or Walter, and they will be able to answer the questions to write to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Just once again, thanks a lot.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for your participation. Thanks for your informative presentations. It was very interesting indeed. Дорогие друзья, дорогие коллеги, в самом начале я поприветствовала представителей стран, участниц нашего форума, и мне передали информацию еще о представителях нескольких стран, присоединившихся к нашей конференции. И я хочу вместе с вами поприветствовать ученых из Канады, Парагвая, Румынии и Франции, которые сейчас также находятся на нашей конференции. Спасибо, дорогие друзья, за то, что откликнулись на наше приглашение, за то, что мы имеем возможность сегодня видеть и слышать вас. Наше пленарное заседание подошло к концу, но прежде чем перейти к работе круглого стола, я хочу поделиться с вами следующей информацией. Для участников конференции организованы программы повышения квалификации. Леонид Николаевич, я подожду, наверное, минутку, чтобы вы могли выставить заставочку наших программ повышения квалификации. Ну, видимо, небольшая заминка. Ну, уже что-то происходит. И я думаю, что через несколько секунд мы увидим эту заставку. Леонид Николаевич, я могу вас услышать?
Наталья, несколько секунд, все будет.
Отлично, большое спасибо. Спасибо. Дорогие друзья, нам нужно подождать несколько секунд, чтобы вышла заставка программы повышения квалификации, в связи с тем, что на этой заставке будет изображен QR-код, по которому вы сможете перейти на программы. Может быть, кому-то из вас понадобятся телефоны, чтобы сфотографировать заставку с QR-кодом. Ну, а пока мы ждем вот эту заставочку, Все отлично, все уже на экране. Итак, повторюсь еще раз. Для вас, мои уважаемые коллеги, для всех участников конференции «Функциональные аспекты межкультурной коммуникации и проблемы перевода» организованы программы повышения квалификации. Вам предоставляется выбор из 3 программ. По завершении обучения все участники программ получат соответствующие сертификаты. Для того, чтобы поступить на программу, на одну из 3 программ, вам необходимо по QR-коду перейти на эти программы, выбрать наиболее интересующую вас, оплатить ее. 23 ноября будет проводиться пробное занятие, а с 24 ноября вы приступаете к работе. Дорогие друзья, по нашей программе мы переходим к работе круглого стола. Наш круглый стол носит название «Тематические тренды научных публикаций и этическая политика журналов». В круглом столе принимают участие зарубежные редакторы журналов, входящих в первые кварталы Scopus и Web of Science. Я с большим удовольствием предоставляю слово для ведения круглого стола заместителю директора Института иностранных языков Российского университета дружбы народов, доктору социологических наук, доценту Шароновой Светлане Алексеевне. Светлана Алексеевна, пожалуйста.
Спасибо большое, уважаемые гости, уважаемые участники конференции. Позвольте поприветствовать вас и открыть круглый стол, посвященный, как Наталья Леонидовна сказала, тематическим трендам в исследованиях, в исследовательских публикациях и этической политике научных журналов в области образования и психологии. Регламент круглого стола у нас следующий. Сначала выступают докладчики по 20-25 минут. В конце мы оставим время для вопросов. Вопросы можно задавать докладчикам в чате на русском языке, поскольку идет синхронный перевод, и я зачитаю в конце все вопросы. Большая просьба указывать имена докладчиков, кому обращен ваш вопрос. Первым докладчиком я приглашаю Ванессу Деннен. Есть Ванесса здесь с нами? Пока я вижу только Роджера Салье. Привет, Роджер.
Thank you.
Тогда, раз Ванесса пока отсутствует, давайте начнем с вас. Роджер Салье...
Ванесса подключилась.
Okay.
Да? О, отлично. Извините тогда.
Okay.
Светлана
Okay.
Алексеевна,
Sorry.
да, Ванесса есть.
Хорошо, Ванесса, мы вас приглашаем с вашим докладом выступить в данный момент на нашем круглом столе. Ждем.
Английский, русский. Слышно? Она, наверное, не слышит?
Еще раз сказать, да?
Vanessa, do you hear us?
Yes, I do.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for participation. We are glad to see you.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here. Are you ready for me to begin now?
Yes,
Yeah,
yes.
we do.
Okay, then I will begin. Let me get my slides. Oh, I need screen sharing permission.
Леонид Николаевич, нам нужно разрешение для того, чтобы поделиться экраном. Ванесса готова говорить. Vanessa, it may take just a minute.
Okay, it looks like it will work now.
No.
Наталья Леонидовна, я хочу отметить, что Ванесса в середине ночи выступает с нами.
Oh, it's night time, yeah?
Yes, it is 3 in the morning.
Thank you very much for this sleepless night. We appreciate you are here with us.
Oh, it is my pleasure. I wish I could be there with you in person.
We wish to and hope to see you sometime.
Okay, well, I will start talking then. So I am here to talk with you today about the topics of our research and thinking about what we choose to do our research on, what we are publishing. And I would like to make the distinction today between what we currently feel we can publish and what we really should be publishing, and how we then make what we should publish turn into what we can publish. And I'm speaking today bringing in multiple perspectives. I am a journal editor. I edit a journal called The Internet and Higher Education. And my journal focuses on exactly what you would think from the title, manuscripts that are focused on the use of the internet in the context of higher education. And I say that, although we do often receive manuscripts submitted to us from people that are about neither the internet nor the higher education, which does puzzle me at times. And more specifically, we look at pedagogical issues in that context. I have also edited multiple books, which is a slightly different perspective on publishing than working as a journal editor. And of course, I have worked as an author and as a mentor to many junior scholars as well. And those multiple perspectives from publishing in different realms, as well as trying to get my own work published and helping other people, have given me a very broad perspective on what happens in the publishing process and what different authors do or don't do that results in their work getting successfully published or perhaps not successfully published. So with that in mind, I encourage you to all take a brief moment to reflect on why you became a scholar in the first place. What led you to continue to pursue your studies and to want to be the researcher who you are today? You probably can remember and come up with a reason or two. Now, I'm going to ask you, what did you answer to yourself there? Was it because there was a question that you really wanted to answer or a problem to solve? Were you hoping that the research you would do would somehow make the world a better place? Or did you sit out and say, I want to publish a lot of journal articles? I'm asking this question because my guess is that most of you did not enter your career paths saying, I'm doing this because I want to publish a lot of journal articles. I know I did not start my work for that reason. I started it because I have a passion for the problems in my field. In my case, distance learning, and I wanted to help people learn how to be better as instructors or to be more successful as learners working in that realm. However, I do feel the pressure on a regular basis to publish a lot of journal articles, and you probably do too. And that's because we have this tension between researchers and institutions that they work at. And we can ask the question here of, is the tail wagging the dog? Who is in charge here? Is it the researcher or the institution? I know that as a researcher on my own, I would probably make some different choices about the work that I do than the choices that I make as a researcher at my institution. My institution wants me to publish at least 4 peer-reviewed journal articles a year. And that pressure changes my behavior as a researcher. I am always looking for opportunities to publish. Sometimes that feels like the number of articles that I publish may be more important than exactly what I am publishing. When I go back and think about the beginning of my career and why I started doing this, I know that what I'm publishing is more important to me personally than how many articles, but it's easy to lose sight of that perspective and to let my institution's wishes be the driving force. Unfortunately, when I follow that inclination to publish more and more just because my institution wants me to, that can lead to poor research and research that isn't really all that publishable. Now, if we think about what publishers are looking for, they're not looking for the quantity of publications from any one researcher, but rather they're looking for the quality of those publications. And they're looking for publications that are making a true contribution to the field or discipline, not a contribution to the CV of the author or a contribution to the publication count of the institution. So again, we have a discrepancy there of the goals of the different groups. So let's think about what the research is that we can do. The research that we can do in terms of topics or in terms of methods. When I mentor junior scholars and I hear them talking about the research that they feel that they can do, they'll often say, well, what topic would get me published? That's the research I can do right now. Or what's the hot method that I should be using right now? I'm seeing a lot of publications that use SEM, structural equation modeling right now. It seems to be the trend to do that. They're not getting successfully published because often the underlying research question isn't really one of great consequence. It's just research that somebody did using a fancy research method. In the end, it doesn't impress the peer reviewers all that much. If we think about the research that we can do with our participants, we often just think about the participants who are very easy for us to access. It won't be too much trouble for us to do that research. And in terms of timing, well, I want to do something that I could do quickly so that I can get that publication right away. Because I have multiple publications that I need to get. I have that institutional pressure. And this leads to the pitfalls for different researchers. One of them is convenience. I've pictured here a convenience store that is in many parts of the world, the 7-Eleven store. I looked it up online to see, I see you don't have them in Russia, but perhaps some of you have traveled around to places where the 7-Eleven store is located. And nobody goes to the 7-Eleven store because it is of high quality. Nobody goes to the 7-Eleven store thinking, yes, I'm going to find the very best things there. We go there because it's convenient for us. And sometimes we do that same thing in research. We go there because it's convenient. We have an opportunity sitting in front of us with people who are willing to be participants in our research, with data that's just waiting to be collected or perhaps has already been collected. Every once in a while, something good comes out of that, but sometimes it was just convenient. The second pitfall is trendiness. And we all probably recognize the downside of trendiness in our everyday lives. You probably have that article of clothing that you bought because it was trendy and you didn't really like the way that it looked on you. It isn't great, but you got it because it was trendy. We do the same thing with research. We hear that something is popular or a trend, and we think that by publishing it will somehow benefit us. And so we grab that trendy item and try to do it. Now, the problem with trends is that they can go away as quickly as they begin. And a lot of people try to do them all at once. A lot of what is done on a trend doesn't actually get through and get published in the end. And I have seen this as as a journal editor with trend after trend after trend for the last decade, that people follow those trends. A lot of journal articles will get submitted on them, and a lot of journal articles will get rejected on that basis. And then there is researcher laziness. We're tired. We want to do the thing that is easiest for us to do. I see a lot of researchers in particular struggle with laziness when it comes to getting permission to access the research participants or the research setting that would be the best fit for their research, and instead going with what is most convenient. So when I think about, as a journal editor, what gets desk rejected from my journal, I see three issues that are related to these pitfalls of convenience, of trendiness, and of laziness. Because I am looking at articles to see what is rigorous. How good is the research that's been submitted to me? What is the purpose of it? What is motivating this research? And the motivation can't just be that it was convenient and trendy for the researcher to do it. And how important is it? How great is the contribution to the field? And that means that I'm evaluating those manuscripts to see that the author knows what kind of a contribution it is making to the field, fully understands what research has been done before, how this new research adds to it in a meaningful way for the field, and is also thinking about what the practical and research and theoretical implications of the research will be. And so when I receive manuscripts that are lacking in these areas, I don't send those out to review. Still, many of the manuscripts that I do send out to review get rejected by the peer reviewers for one of these three reasons. So I ask us to stop thinking about the research we can do, instead start thinking about what research we should be doing. What are the topics that our field really needs us to be researching right now? What are the problems that we need to solve? What are the questions that we have that if we are able to answer those questions, will get us to the next level? What are the methods, not that are trendy right now, but the methods that will truly help us answer these questions? We want to use those methods, even if it's a little bit more difficult and a little bit more effort for us. Similarly, who are the participants who will yield the best data for us? Not the participants who are easiest for me to find, but if I make that extra effort, if I take the time to build the relationships, make the connections, and get the research permissions, what participants would be the best ones for me to access? And in terms of time, I should take however much time it takes to do that research well. So now if I think about this in the positive sense, what research is getting accepted right now? The research that's getting accepted is that which is substantive, and it provides new insight into a field. It's not something that's been done previously that's just being done with another set of people or in a location, but that it really allows us to look at a problem in a different way or try a different meaningful solution with that problem. And so it's responsive to the needs of the field. And those are needs of other researchers, our theoretical needs, and our practical needs. By being responsive to those things, we're also being meaningful and having implications for research theory and practice. I'll start to wrap this up now and think about what does all of this mean for us in the age of COVID? COVID-19 has created some opportunities for research, and it's created some challenges for research. Many of the things that we were trying to do for research that involved looking at practices in face-to-face settings or accessing our research participants in face-to-face settings have become much more difficult for us to do. And even research that we thought might not have been tremendously affected by COVID-19 has been tremendously affected by COVID-19 because our participants are experiencing fatigue at this time. They may be less willing to participate in our research. But what I'm finding is that it's generating a lot of research on its own. Then we have to go back and ask ourselves these questions of, does this research have rigor, and is it meaningful at this time? How is this time different from previous times? Well, I see a lot of research that is on distance education, and I saw that before COVID-19, but now so many more people are teaching using online tools, so everybody is doing this. However, I'm finding myself having to desk reject a lot of manuscripts because they're not asking the questions that have meaning to the field. They're instead taking advantage of an opportunity of a large number of people who are learning using online tools and thinking that now they'll have a great sample size. So I am not joking when I tell you that almost every single day right now, I receive a manuscript from somebody who has surveyed more than 1,000 students, sometimes 5,000 students, wonderful sample sizes. And the research question that they have asked is something like, do these students like the remote online learning that they're experiencing during COVID-19? Do you think you could answer that question on your own? Usually the answer is no, nobody is very happy about being pushed to online learning during COVID-19. And yet I am receiving studies about that almost every single day. Everybody is asking the same question, spending a lot of resources on this. When you think about all of the effort of the people who are taking the time to answer those surveys, and then the people who are taking the time to analyze those results and write them up. For research that is not really meaningful, I'm not sure that this is what we needed to learn from this time, or that we will want to learn from this time. If we think about 5 years from now and we look back at it, is this what would be most meaningful to know? But there are opportunities still to research things that are being done at this time. So I think we need to ask this question of what will we want to learn? In 5 years or in 10 years, when we look back, what will be the research that we would continue to cite and build on that was done during this time that is different from what we have known in the past? How will the things that we learn at this time inform what we do in the future? And so that's the mission that I like to put researchers on right now. I think that we should all be identifying what we should be publishing. What are those meaningful questions, no matter how challenging it may be for us to start finding the answers to those questions, and no matter what barriers stand in the way of us doing that research, and find a way to make that research that we should publish the research that we can publish. It may take a little more thinking, it may take a little more effort, but in the end, it is more likely to yield research that really does get published and that does get cited by other people, because it is impactful, because it is meaningful. And so I thank you very much for listening to my perspectives on the publishing process. I am happy to answer questions, but I think we're going to have discussion and questions of all of this at the end of everybody's talk.
Благодарим Ванессу. Ванесса, мы попросили вопросы писать в чате, и в конце круглого стола зачитаем эти вопросы, обращенные к вам, ко всем докладчикам, и у вас будет время ответить. Хорошо?
Светлана Алексеевна, я прошу прощения. Vanessa, I would like to express great gratitude to you for the participation and this vivid speech. As for me, it was extremely useful. Thank you very much. It's Natalia Sokolova speaking. Thanks a lot.
Thank you for having me.
Значит, перед нами выступала Ванесса Ден, главный редактор журнала «Интернет и высшее образование», который входит в первую квартиру базы данных Scopus. Она профессор учебных систем и технологий обучения Государственного университета Флорида в США. Спасибо огромное, Ванесса. Очень благодарны и признательны вам за ваш доклад. Дальше мы предоставим слово Роджеру Салье, который с нами уже находится сразу же. Это соредактор журнала «Обучение, культура, социальное взаимодействие», профессор кафедры образования, коммуникации и обучения Гетеборгского университета Швеции. Пожалуйста, Роджер.
Thank you. And yeah, I will try to share my screen. Yeah, can you see it?
Yes, we can. Thank you very much. It's here.
Yeah. Thank you very much for this invitation to participate in this conference. I too, I'm sorry. I listened to the introductory speeches this morning, and I too, I'm sorry I am not with you, but these are very difficult times, and I have had a habit of going to Moscow every year for the past few years, so I really miss our visits. But I would like to speak on I am in the same situation as Vanessa is. I'm the editor of a journal called Learning, Culture and Social Interaction. So I'm in the midst of this flow of research that wants to be published, and research that is published, and research that isn't published, and the issues of the tensions between sort of research and the relevance of research, the production of research and the relevance of research. I think that Vanessa brought up is a very interesting topic to reflect on. The field of, I've been an editor of several journals, and journal publication has become an industry of enormous significance to academia, to researchers, and to the community, but also it's a very big business nowadays, and we have these big publishing houses that run thousands of journals. I think the two companies, publishing houses I've worked with mostly are Elsevier and Springer, and I think they have well over 5,000 journals that they publish, and so there's clearly a lot of there's an interesting background to this expansion of publishing, and in particular the expansion of journal article publishing. Some of it has to do with the fact that there are more people doing research, and more knowledge is produced. Somebody said that maybe 80% of all the researchers that ever lived are living now, and are producing research, and of course that is puts a pressure on the publishing and the capacities to make your research visible. But I too worry, as I understood Vanessa did, about this balance between publishing and relevance. And I don't want to be too strict on this, because there are various reasons why people want to publish. They want to make a career, and on the one hand, and on the other hand, they want to report significant findings to the world. And somewhere in there's a trade-off between these two, where publishing sometimes may become an end in itself. And Vanessa mentioned the departmental pressures that are exist in this area, I think more or less all over the world, because one of the things that have happened during the past 20 years, and even stronger during the past 10 years, is that we see this pressure increasing all over the world. And in my current position, I receive manuscripts from countries that never used to submit manuscripts, where the scholars were publishing in their own countries, in local journals, and maybe not even publishing in journals, but rather in reports and so-called gray literature. But nowadays, through institutional pressures and through all these international comparisons, they are encouraged / forced to publish internationally in internationally recognized journals that are listed in the various citation systems and so on. And I think this, at the level of sociology of science, I think this is a very interesting development, and something to study in its own right, the dynamics of this and what drives these trends. But I would like to, in the time given to me, to just say something which is more limited. And we heard in the introductory speeches today this issue of learning language, and that serves as an example of something that I I think is of interest in the particular context where I'm going to comment on. And I want to use my background in research on development and learning to reflect a bit on research and the conditions of research in a digital age. And by a digital age, in this case, I actually mean to some extent what has happened in the post-war period, but very much during the last 10 years, when children have begun to participate in forms of communication that they never had access to before. And a part of my, so for instance, in my own country, at around the age of 5 or 6, almost 100% of the children are on the internet, and they're on their own, and they meet written language, they meet English long before they encounter it in school. So many of the targets for learning that were previously very much something you learned at school is now communicated and is now presented outside school settings. And I think this raises interesting issues on research ethics and epistemic responsibilities of research on childhood. So how should we portray children? What is the concept of a child in a digital age, and what implications does that have for our research? And this is what I will comment on briefly here as a contribution to our discussion on research publications. And the general background of this specific point is that I have an interest in the categories that researchers in developmental psychology, instructional psychology, learning, and so on, use for reporting and communicating their research and research findings. And by categories, I mean, how do we describe people? Do we describe them as competent or as incompetent? Do we describe them as fully active people, or do we describe them as people who lack motivation or lack interest or lack anything? This problem of much research, that they have this sort of negative scholarly rationalism, that is, you describe people in what they cannot do in terms of their incompetence rather than in the areas of competence. And I do this under the awareness of the assumption that we always in research, we have to reduce complexity. We can never study and report on human phenomena such as learning, interaction, knowledge acquisition, and so on, in all of their complexities. We have to reduce complexity. So an interesting point is, how do we do this, and how do different traditions do this? And what is happening now when we, as I will argue, see a new childhood emerge in many societies. And I do this, my comments are also related to the background, the concrete work of being an editor or serving on editorial teams, and that we have increasingly strict rules for research ethics in conducting conducting research and in publishing research. So there are, in many cases, we nowadays have to reject manuscripts because they are not ethically sound. I actually did that just a few days ago, because the research may have been ethically sound, but there was not enough documentation that this actually had taken place. And this is, of course, this problem is evident in situations where you study children and young people in preschool, schools, in voluntary activities outside school, and so on. And so I think this whole discussion of research ethics is a part of this problem of what is worth researching and worth publishing. We also have increasing expectations of transparency of research in all its phases, not just that it's conducted in a way that is in accordance with ethical rules, and that you can verify that and make it obvious that you followed ethical rules, but there's now also expectations that you can access the data, that you that you base your conclusions on. And many journals now have allow you to upload original data so as to make it possible for readers to interact with the empirical materials that you have collected and that you draw your conclusions from. And I think we'll see more of this, these types of developments. And while all this is happening, sort of trying to be explicit about the formalities of research, we have, as I said, the challenges that are, I think, are posed by contemporary childhoods, where socialization takes place in novel circumstances, in novel social configurations, for instance, through internet-mediated activities. And this is then the second or third digital revolution which came to affect children and childhood very much. Children can now independently engage with communities and generate information and make experiences more or less outside the control of their families through the internet then. So we are seeing a new type of childhood where it's not just the family, it's not just the local community, it's not just the school or the preschool that has a some sort of control or overview over how children socialize. Children are socialized. Children now also socialize themselves to a large extent through interaction that is not controlled by institutions or families. And this, I think, is an interesting research problem because the ecology of childhood is changing dramatically in many countries. So just to raise these issues, I won't try to comment on them, but we have a traditions of research where we saw sort of children were viewed as objects of research. We interviewed them, so they were interviewees. They were respondents to questions. They were experimental subjects. We exposed them to experiments and so on. And the units of analysis in such research were, depending on your theoretical orientation, were behaviors or thought processes, cognition, thinking, motivation, IQ, and all of this was described as if it was localized, as if they were localized within children. So by asking children questions, you could sort of tap their intellectual competencies or intellectual development or motivations or whatever you were interested in. And the issues of validity and reliability of these kinds of research, we have a long tradition for evaluating those, and they were then based on assumptions of or in an interest in whether the exact situations you studied, the experiments you made, the questions you asked, the questionnaires you distributed were valid and reliable within that particular framework of looking at children as objects, as not yet citizens, as not just active members of society, but as some sort of premature adults. And in recent decades or recent years, we have seen these other theoretical alternatives emerging where childhood is understood very differently. It's childhood is not being young is sort of not a route to becoming adult. These periods of life have their own values and their own sort of significance for people. So it's not just planning for the future that is relevant, but also researching children and young people in their own terms and looking at their activities as meaningful in their own ways. And this view of childhood historically actually emerged in the Enlightenment period in the 18th century with people like Rousseau and the philosophers and pedagogues of this time who tried to envision a view or produce a view of children where children were sort of seen as capable of reflection, as capable of developing if they were nourished, if they were engaged in tasks that are that are meaningful for them, and where they can sort of contribute by engaging with the task, not just by being exposed to something. So we now see, and this is a challenge to research, and this is my point, I think a shift, and this shift is more like an addition, because the traditional kind of research on the left-hand side is still continuing and is still dominant. But we are also now seeing research on children, young people, that view them as agents, acting in what Vygotsky calls social situations that are different from what they were previously. They are they display their knowledge not by responding to researchers' questions or by responding to formally arranged tasks only, but they display their competence through their capacity to participate and their capacity to contribute. And this, I think, is what the era of the internet, and particularly the last 10 years since the introduction of the tablet, the iPad and its equivalents, because through those practices, you are with the touchscreen and the app and so on, you're able to participate in activities which are more complex than the ones you master. You do not have to be able to read to participate in many of the online activities like watching movies and film clips and YouTubes and so on. But actually these contexts or these activities become context for learning. They become context for participation, context for engagement and involvement. So many of the traditional, or some of the traditional roles that education had of making children read and interact with books and information and so on have now shifted and are parts of children's everyday lives in the home, in the family, and they do it largely on their own. So I think this is an interesting shift of units of analysis in research, where children's skills are demonstrated in interaction with other people, in involvement in activities, and that we realize that children are nested into practices, and that the learning trajectories differ in such situations. So for instance, in the Nordic countries, children from the age of 2 or 3 are now exposed to English in context in which they are active, not just by listening to music and radio and television, on which they used to, but they also engage with the English language in particular from a very early age. And this is a revolution in the learning of a foreign language, in the ecology in which you learn a foreign language, which is much more efficient and has a value which goes way beyond what schools can produce during single hours during a week. So they live in an ecology where they realize that by learning a foreign language, there are things I can do. So I think one of the interesting things here is that the learning trajectories differ. Many of the learning trajectories of mastering mediated activities come to differ. Children first encounter things that they do not master, but by being involved in these situations, they learn things that they did not master before. And my argument would be that the validity and reliability issues in these kinds of research are very different than the ones that we see on the left-hand side. Here you have to understand the context in which children are active and how they are active, and what that activity implies in terms of developing this constant exposure to zones of proximal development. So I think that I would like to see us grappling more with these developmental psychology, to grapple more with the issues of how children learn by using these tools, and how they become sort of involved in activities that children never used to be involved before. And what does this imply for their learning? And how can we organize these learning trajectories so that more children can profit from them? Okay, thank you very much. That was my contribution. I'm sorry, there was some disturbance on the on the connection. I hope you could hear me.
Спасибо огромнейшее, Роджер. Ой, прошу прощения. Да, Роджер, огромное спасибо. Все прекрасно было слышно, очень интересный доклад. И я думаю, все-таки вопросы у нашей аудитории возникнут. Или какие-то комментарии, которые созвучны вашим переживаниям, вашим идеям. У нас должен еще выступать Ян Томпсон, редактор журнала «Педагогическое образование», доцент департамента образования Оксфордского университета Великобритании. Но пока что-то он не вышел на связь. Возможно, у нашей аудитории возникли вопросы к нашим докладчикам. Я посмотрела, вижу только в чате слова благодарности, но затронуты очень важные вопросы. И я надеюсь, что все-таки вы сможете задать эти вопросы вот людям, которые сейчас на данный момент выделили время и выступают перед вами. Но у меня к вам, Иванесса и Роджер, один вопрос, традиционный для нашей российской аудитории исследователей. Скажите, пожалуйста, какой процент российских ученых публикуете вы в своем журнале? Какой процент статей? Есть у вас российские статьи российских ученых или нет? Пожалуйста, Ванесса или Роджер, сможете сказать нам?
Should I start?
Да.
Yes, yes, we definitely do have Russian scholars. We had a special issue on Galperin just very recently, where there were Russian and people from other countries, scholars from other countries, Norway, other parts of Europe, and the US publishing. I also know that this is just off the top of my head. I don't have my journal in front of me, but I remember recently there was a very interesting example, a very interesting article co-published by Nikolai Veraksa from the Lomonosov University with a European colleague. And yeah, there are many, we have Russian publications, publications with Russian authors. If your question is, are they proportionate to the amount of research carried out in developmental psychology in Russia? I would say no. I think we would like to have more publications, and I'm saying this sort of out of self-interest because I myself have a background in Vygotskian and Piagetian psychology, so I know that your tradition in the Vygotskian and social cultural field is very strong. So we encourage publications from that with a Russian background. I mean, meaning in this case, not the country, but the people who can read these works in their original language and read them with some sort of depth of understanding. So I would say that we do publish, and as I said, we have this special issue, but I think there is, to think in proportions, we would welcome more submissions.
I'll jump in here, and we do have submissions that come in from Russia. I have a co-editor, and so I don't know the full magnitude of the submissions that would be coming in. I would say that each year I end up handling maybe 3 or 4 manuscripts out of about 350 to 400 that I personally handle each year that would be coming from Russia. If I'm remembering correctly, most of them do end up getting desk rejected. And the problem that I recall happening is that the manuscripts did not really fit the scope of the journal. That they were manuscripts that were much more focused on technology development and assessment as opposed to the pedagogical issues that we focus on in the journal. But one of the things that our group, our editors and editorial board group, has spent a lot of time talking about is how much we wish we were hearing more diverse voices, seeing research from other parts of the world getting published in the journal. Because right now what we are seeing is a lot of people from North America, from Australia, from the UK, from certain parts of Europe, Germany, Netherlands, who are successful at publishing. To a lesser degree, some people coming from Asian countries, although we have a lot of manuscripts that are desk rejected. Our acceptance rate is under 10%. So we're seeing a lot of manuscripts that are coming in from China or South Korea that are getting rejected, although a small number of those are managing to get through the peer review process. But we would really like to be seeing more coming in from different countries, and we have the space to get those published. And the biggest advice I would give to people who are submitting from places where they have not seen a lot of representation from their country is to take a good look at the journal that you're submitting to before you submit. See what else has been published there. Make sure that your article really is a good topical fit for that journal and that you have followed the general format in your article that you see being followed in the manuscripts that are published there. And those are the kinds of things that help get past the editor's desk and get out into the peer review process.
Thank you very much for your answer.
Спасибо огромное, Роджер, Ванесса. Есть еще вопросы? Вот я тут вижу что-то. Вот пишут: мы очень благодарны уважаемым докладчикам, многие из них жертвуют ночным сном и отдыхом, но для нас это очень ценно. Благодарим. К сожалению, наш третий докладчик Ян Томпсон не смог выйти на связь. Мы с ним пытались связаться, но ответа нет. Он прислал свою презентацию, мы поделились ей в чате, так что вы можете, все участники, зайти по адресу, который указан в чате, и посмотреть его презентацию. Наталья Леонидовна, вы хотите сказать несколько слов нашим докладчикам?
Да, конечно.
Пожалуйста, Наталья Леонидовна Соколова, это директор Института иностранных языков Российского университета дружбы народов, на чьей территории мы и кто является главным инициатором для организации проведения данной конференции. Пожалуйста, Наталья Леонидовна.
Дорогие коллеги, участники пленарного заседания, участники круглого стола, я хочу еще раз выразить вам глубокую признательность за то, что в такое непростое время вы оказали нам честь и приняли участие в нашей ежегодной традиционной конференции. Я очень благодарна Ванессе за то, что она провела бессонную ночь с нами. Ну, поистине мы сблизились невероятно. Вся та информация, которая сегодня нами получена во время работы пленарной сессии, вся та информация, которая нам предоставлена редактором журнала, соредактором журнала, безусловно, является хорошим подспорьем как в нашей теоретической работе научной, так и в нашей публикационной активности. Вы знаете, что интерес к журналам из баз данных ВОС и Scopus растет во всем мире, и интерес к тому, чтобы опубликоваться в рейтинговых журналах, также растет год от года. Мы были бы очень рады сотрудничать и с Ванессой Деннен, и с Роджером Селлей, с журналами The Internet and Higher Education, Learning, Culture and Social Interaction. И очень надеемся на вашу поддержку. Естественно, преподаватели, научные сотрудники Института иностранных языков РУДН воспользуются всеми рекомендациями и Ванессы, и Роджера. Мы, естественно, изучим материалы журналов, постараемся соответствовать формату и будем не только рады, но мы будем испытывать определенную гордость, если вы сочтете возможным в какой-то момент опубликовать статьи ученых Института иностранных языков Российского университета дружбы народов. Дорогие мои, большое-большое спасибо. И, конечно, я хочу выразить надежду на то, что вот этот период, я даже не могу назвать его периодом разобщения, этот период пандемии пройдет, и мы уже сможем увидеть друг друга воочию, обнять друг друга. Вы, конечно же, все, я надеюсь, приедете к нам в Москву. Мы сможем вам показать наш красивый город, поделиться своим гостеприимством, теплом своих сердец, выразить вам воочию ту невероятную благодарность, ту признательность, которую мы испытываем по отношению к вам всем вместе и каждому в отдельности. До новых встреч. Я надеюсь, что наша дружба, начавшаяся в рамках этой конференции, будет продолжаться долгие годы. Дорогие друзья, мы завершаем работу круглого стола, а дальше мы переходим к работе в секциях. Работа в секциях начнется с 13:00, с часу дня. То есть в связи с тем, что у нас не было одного из докладчиков на круглом столе, образовалось некоторое время, которое даст возможность участникам конференции перекусить, выпить чайку, немножечко отдохнуть. Очень жаль, что мы не можем сделать это все вместе, как в соответствии с традицией нашей конференции. Обычно в перерыве мы все вместе обедаем, обмениваемся мнениями, ближе знакомимся. Но я надеюсь, что все это еще у нас впереди. Итак, работы секций. Первый трек это будет работать на платформе Microsoft Teams. И первая секция начнет свою работу в 13:00 и будет продолжать ее до 14:30. Первая секция носит название «Межкультурная коммуникация, язык и личность». И ведет ее представитель Института иностранных языков Марина Георгиевна Петрова. Вторая секция будет проходить с 14:40 до 16:10. Она носит название «Социальные аспекты межкультурной коммуникации» и ведет ее доктор социологических наук, профессор Людмила Александровна Василенко, представитель РАН-Хикс. Третья секция «Межкультурная коммуникация и проблемы перевода и переводоведения» будет проходить с 16:20 до 17:50. Ее будет вести сотрудник кафедры теории и практики иностранных языков Института иностранных языков Муравьев, простите, пожалуйста, РУДН, Юрий Александрович Муравьев. Второй трек будет проходить на платформе Zoom. И ко второму треку относятся 4-я, 5-я, 6-я, 7-я секции. Секция номер 4 – преподавание, обучение, перевод и коммуникация, китайский дискурс. Начинается в 13:00 и продолжается 1,5 часа до 14:30. Ее будет вести руководитель международной службы Университета науки и технологий Ляонинь, Китай, кандидат филологических наук, доцент Елена Цой и кандидат филологических наук, доцент Олег Анатольевич Тимофеев, Институт иностранных языков. Секция номер 5 – коммуникация и интерпретация. Эту секцию будет вести профессор Оанес Хафиан, руководитель исследовательской лаборатории «Язык и культурные формы» Высшего института языков Туниса, Университета Карфагена, Тунис. Секция номер 6. Да, я прошу прощения, возвращаясь к предыдущей секции. Секция номер 5. Секция Оанеса Хафиана начнет свою работу в 14:40 и будет продолжать ее до 16:10. Секция номер 6. Лингвистические и культурные аспекты в переводе. Эту секцию ведет профессор Энрике Хервилья, декан факультета перевода Университета Гранады, Испания. Секция начнет свою работу в 16:20 и будет продолжать до 17:50. С 18 часов до 19:30 пройдет секция номер 6 «Преподавание русского языка в университетах США в период пандемии». Ее будет вести доцент Оксана Уиллис, представитель университета Бакнелл, Пенсильвания, США, и Полина де Сантис, профессор Европейского департамента дистанционного обучения Военного института иностранных языков Министерства обороны Соединенных Штатов Америки. Оба ведущих секций представители Соединенных Штатов Америки. Трек номер 3 пройдет на платформе Microsoft Teams, начнется в 13:00. Секция номер 8 – лингвистический межкультурный компонент в понимании социокультурной реальности. Эту секцию ведет доктор филологических наук, доцент Яна Александровна Волкова, представитель Института иностранных языков РУДН, Россия. Секция будет продолжать свою работу до 14:30. В 14:40 начнет свою работу секция номер 9 «Межкультурная коммуникация в образовательной деятельности». Ее также будет вести представитель Института иностранных языков РУДН, кандидат филологических наук Татьяна Геннадьевна Станчуляк. Секция закончит свою работу в 16:10. Трек номер 4. Платформа Microsoft Teams. Специальная секция «Культура и образование. Социальные трансформации и мультикультурная коммуникация». Это будет первый воркшоп «Цивилизация российского образования». Начнется работа в 13:00, закончится в 15:00. И ведет эту работу доктор социологических наук, профессор Людмила Александровна Василенко, РАН-Хикс, и доктор социологических наук, доцент Елена Александровна Назарова, МГИМО. Еще одна специальная секция «Культура и образование, социальные трансформации и мультикультурная коммуникация», workshop 2, начнет свою работу в 15:10-17:10, и workshop 2 носит название «Социальный, политический и экономический контексты в современном изменяющемся обществе». И ведет эту программу доктор социологических наук, доцент Института иностранных языков РУДН Светлана Алексеевна Шаронова. Дорогие друзья, я от всей души желаю успехов в работе всем нашим секциям, 2 воркшопам, а всем присутствующим здоровья, удачи, успехов, благополучия, добра и мира. Будьте с нами. Давайте работать вместе. Давайте встречаться чаще. А Институт иностранных языков всегда с вами. И двери наши всегда открыты. Очень ждем окончания пандемии, очень ждем очной встречи с каждым из вас, со всеми вами вместе. Еще раз глубочайшая благодарность за то, что вы откликнулись на наше приглашение, за то, что вы сегодня с нами, за то, что вы взяли на себя труд участия в такой глобальной конференции. Мы вас очень любим. Следите за нашими событиями на сайте. Будьте всегда с нами. Всегда и всюду ваш Институт иностранных языков Российского университета дружбы народов.
Наталья Леонидовна, позволите сделать 2 объявления важных?
Да, конечно, Наталья Станиславовна.
Значит, первый, я буду по-русски тогда обращаться. В чат мы выслали правильную ссылку на первый трек. Обратите на это внимание. И второй момент. Ян Томпсон извиняется, что не смог присоединиться, но он поделится своей презентацией, и мы ее тоже сбросим в чат.
Отлично, все.
Дорогие друзья, пока все еще подключены к этому треку, мы хотим порадовать вас клипом и песней об Институте иностранных языков, которую записали наши студенты. Ну и в самом конце вы услышите маленький отрывок, припев из нашего гимна. Итак, в качестве такого маленького сувенира песня, записанная студентами Института иностранных языков РУДН. Песня посвящена нашему институту. И после того, как будет продемонстрирован клип, вы услышите маленький отрывок из нашего гимна. Успехов, удачи, здоровья, друзья!
Мы верим и мечтаем. Мы там, где нас так ждали, где на семи ветрах один мотив в сердцах. Через тернии прямо к звездам, и я здесь так легко и просто, и я мы только побеждаем, если падаем.